The light was almost gone when I reached the barn. That kind of dusk that doesn't fall, it sinks, slow and heavy, until everything turns the same quiet shade of blue. The door groaned when I pulled it open, like it was waking up after a long sleep. Dust lifted off the floorboards in soft spirals, catching what little light was left. I hadn't stepped inside that barn in 10 years. But the moment the air touched my face, warm, still, familiar, it felt like the place had been waiting for me. And somewhere deep inside, I felt something waiting. I took a few steps inside, careful, like the wood might remember every footstep I'd ever taken in this place. My father used to say barns had long memories. They held everything, secrets, seasons, voices, whether you meant for them to or not. The smell hadn't changed. Old hay. Dry wood. A little bit of rust. It wrapped around me the way a childhood blanket does, warm at first, then suddenly too tight. The tools on the wall were right where he left them. The hammer with the splintered handle. The rusted pruning shears he swore he'd fix one day. A metal pail sitting crooked near the corner. Nothing had moved. Nothing should have moved. But the stillness felt wrong somehow, too arranged, like a picture someone had straightened right before I arrived. I let my fingers trail along the nearest beam. The grain was rough, familiar. I could almost feel my father's hand covering mine, guiding me the way he used to when I was small. Don't force it, he'd say. Wood knows when you're trying too hard. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the place settle. I came here to close a chapter, to sell the land, say my quiet goodbye, and walk away. But the barn was breathing in a way I didn't remember. As if someone else had been standing there only moments before. It wasn't until I turned toward the far wall that my breath caught. At first I thought it was just the way the dusk played tricks on the wood. Shadows stretching, shapes shifting. But even in the dim light, I could see something carved into the boards, something long and deliberate. I walked closer, slow. My chest tightened with every step. The letters came into view one by one, rising from the wood like they'd been waiting to be found. Daniel Hart. My father's name. My father's real, solid, unmistakable name. The carving was deep, too deep for an old pocket knife or a distracted teenager. Each line was clean, sharp, fresh. I reached out before I could talk myself out of it. My fingers brushed the grooves, and a splinter lodged itself in my thumb. Sharp enough to sting. Fresh wood does that. Old wood doesn't. The quiet in the barn thickened, pressing against my ribs. For a moment, I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It didn't make sense, none of it made sense. Because my father had been gone for 10 years. Buried. Mourned. And yet, someone had carved his name here. Not 10 years ago. Not 5. Recently. Recently enough that the cut would still smelled faintly raw. I stepped back from the wall, the air suddenly colder. My skin prickled as if someone had opened a window behind me. But there was no window. Just the door I'd shut tight. The barn felt different now. Not empty. Not quite. I looked around again, slower this time. The shadows clung too closely to the corners. The dust on the floor wasn't evenly spread. There were faint marks, like something had been moved. Or someone. My pulse thudded in my ears. Dad? The word slipped out before I could stop it, soft and foolish and trembling. Nothing answered. But the silence felt aware, like it turned its head toward me. I tried to steady my breathing, counting the way he taught me whenever storms rolled in. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth breath, I caught a scent, faint, but real. Fresh sawdust. It didn't belong here. Not after 10 untouched years. I followed it instinctively, tracking it across the boards until I found the smallest pile of pale curls near the wall. They were too clean, too new, to have been here long. Whoever stood here, whoever carved that name, had been close enough for the scent to linger. Close enough that for a moment I could almost imagine a figure still standing in the doorway, watching me try to make sense of it. And for the first time in years, I felt something I wasn't ready to name. Not fear. Not hope. Something in between. I stood in the center of the barn, the light nearly gone now, the carving behind me like a whisper pressed into my back. The night outside settled soft and heavy, wrapping the barn in quiet. My breath made thin clouds in the air. I placed my palm on the door to leave, but hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough to feel the way the wood pulsed with the day's fading heat. Someone had been here. Someone who knew my father's name. Someone who wanted me to see it. I stepped out into the cold, but the chill crawling up my neck didn't follow me from outside. It had started in that barn. And whatever carved those letters. It wasn't finished with me yet. Morning came slow, like it wasn't sure it wanted to touch the barn. The sky was still grey when I walked across the yard, grass wet against my shoes. The cold felt sharper than the night before, clean, almost metallic, like it had rinsed the world while I slept. I held a flashlight in my hand, the small one I'd found in the junk drawer of my grandmother's kitchen. It flickered as if it didn't want to be part of this either. The barn loomed ahead of me, still, quiet, unchanged. But I could feel something waiting inside. Something carved into wood, and into memory. The door resisted me at first, sticking the way old doors do when they've held silence too long. When it finally opened, a thin rush of warm air pushed past me, as if the barn exhaled after holding its breath all night. Inside, the light was different than I remembered. Softer. Flatter. Like it stayed low to the ground and refused to rise. Dust sat neatly on everything, the pail, the old grain sacks, the leaning ladder against the far beam, untouched, undisturbed. Except for that one place on the wall. The place I'd tried not to think about as I tried, and failed, to sleep. I raised the flashlight, and let the beam slide across the barn in slow strokes. The hay crackled under my feet. The old boards gave a tired groan. I felt like a stranger here, walking through someone else's memories, even though the echoes were mine. A small part of me wished the carving would look different in daylight, smaller, older, less sharp. A trick of dusk light, maybe. A shadow pretending to be a message. But I knew better. Even before the flashlight found it again, glowing pale against the darker boards, I knew what I'd see. His name. My father's name. Fresh as morning. I stepped closer, my breath catching the way it does when you're about to open a door you've avoided for years. The flashlight beam steadied as it fell across the wood. The letters looked even newer in the morning light, the raw, pale cuts bright against the aged boards around them. Wood only looked like that for a short time. Before weather dulled it. Before dust kissed it. I reached out again, slowly, almost afraid the letters might feel warm. When my fingertips touched the grooves, the sting came sharper this time. A fresh cut in wood always bites back a little. And this one bit like it had been carved yesterday. The smell hit me next, faint, but unmistakable. Fresh wood. A scent like open cedar, or a new boardwalk on a warm day. It had no place here. Not after 10 still, untouched years. I swallowed hard. For a moment, I felt like a child again, standing beside my father, as he showed me how to read the hidden signs in the barn. He used to carve secret messages for me. Tiny scratches under shelves, initials tucked behind beams, always smiling like he knew I'd never find them on the first try. "Look closer," he'd say. He never raised his voice. He never hurried me. Just those two quiet words. And standing there now, thumb throbbing from the splinter, heart beating too loud in my ears. I felt him say it again. I took a step back, letting the beam widen. The dust on the floor should have been smooth, a soft, even blanket the way only old barns can keep it. But it wasn't. Near the wall, just below the carving, the layer of dust was disturbed. Not in an obvious way, no clear shoe print, no deep impression, but brushed aside, scattered in a pattern too subtle for chance. Still, when I knelt down, the truth revealed itself in the smallest details. A faint edge. A partial heel. A shift in weight. Footprints, soft and incomplete, but there. And much larger than mine. I stared at them, letting silence stretch around me like a held breath. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing. Someone tall. Someone heavy on his right foot. Someone who knew how to stand still in a barn without leaving a full mark. I followed the faint shapes back a few feet until they dissolved into untouched dust again. Whoever it was, they moved carefully. Purposefully. The way my father used to, like he knew every board by heart. A strange thought crept in as I traced the air above the disturbed dust. What if the footprints weren't meant to be hidden? What if they were meant to be found? The barn felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had inched closer. The air pressed against the back of my neck, warm and heavy, the way it does when someone stands too near. I turned slowly, half expecting a figure behind me. But the barn was empty. Or pretending to be. I stood up slowly, the flashlight trembling just enough for the beam to quiver across the beams. The carving watched me, pale and bright in the dim barn. The footprints faded back into silence. A part of me wanted to leave right then, walk out, close the door, pretend this was all a trick of memory and dust. But another part, the part shaped by my father's quiet lessons, leaned forward instead. "Look closer." I stepped back from the wall, and let the light fall across the barn one more time. Nothing else moved. Nothing else spoke. But the message was clear, even in the stillness. Someone had been here. Someone who knew my father's name. Someone who wanted to lead me somewhere. And I could feel, deep in my bones, that this was only the beginning. The house felt colder than the morning air when I stepped inside. Not a sharp cold, a settled one, like something had been waiting in the corners long before I arrived. My grandmother sat at the kitchen table with her back to the window, shoulders rounded, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. The steam rose slowly, curling toward her face, but never quite reaching her. She didn't look up when I entered. Just stirred her tea in small, uneven circles, the spoon tapping the porcelain like a quiet clock. And for a moment, I wondered if she already knew what I'd seen in the barn. The kitchen hadn't changed in decades. Same sunflower curtains, faded to a dusty yellow. Same kettle on the stove that whistled too early and too loud. Same wooden floor that creaked in all the places my grandfather used to avoid. But my grandmother, she looked smaller in the light. More fragile than she had just yesterday. I hung my jacket over the chair across from her and waited for her to say something. She didn't. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on her tea, as if reading something in the steam that I couldn't see. Her hands had always been steady. Even when I was a child and she worked late into the night sewing patches onto old quilts. But now, as she lifted the spoon, her fingers trembled just enough to catch the light. I sat down slowly. "Grandma," I said, keeping my voice soft, "I went to the barn this morning." The spoon stopped mid-stir. Not abruptly, just enough to break the rhythm. She set it down with a small clink and finally looked at me. Her eyes were pale, washed out by age and something heavier. Something she wasn't ready to speak into the room. "That place doesn't hold anything worth finding," she whispered. But the way her gaze drifted, not to me, but past me, said otherwise. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to read her face the way I used to read her stories. "There's something carved into the wall," I said. I didn't say his name. Not yet. Her shoulders stiffened anyway. A tiny shift, almost invisible, but I saw it. I thought maybe someone came by recently. She shook her head too quickly. "No one comes here." Her voice was thin, but firm. "Practiced." I studied her hands as she reached for her mug. They trembled again, just slightly, as if remembering something they didn't want to repeat. "Grandma," I said gently, "the wood's fresh. Whoever carved it." "Nobody's been in that barn," she snapped, soft but sharp enough to cut the air. Then, just as quickly, her voice softened again. "I keep the doors locked. I check the windows every night. This land hasn't seen a stranger in years." Her words were steady. Her hands were not. I glanced toward the window behind her. The curtains were parted just enough to see the edge of the barn roof. She didn't turn to look, but her eyes flicked there, quick, instinctive. Like she was checking something. Or waiting for someone. I felt the quiet between us expand, settling heavy in the space where truth should have been. "Then how did his name get there?" I asked. Her breath caught. And the room felt suddenly smaller. For a long moment, she said nothing. Just stared down at her hands like they belonged to someone else. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a breath. "You shouldn't have gone in there." I didn't know whether to feel anger or fear. Both came in small waves, touching the edges of my chest but never fully breaking. "Why?" I asked. She looked up at me then, really looked. And I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not grief. Not age. Something closer to dread. "Some things," she began, voice trembling, "are better left where time put them." "But time didn't put that carving there," I said. "Someone did. Recently." She closed her eyes. Only for a moment. But it was long enough for the silence to swell between us. "I told your father the same thing once," she whispered. My breath caught. My heartbeat stalled. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer. Instead, her gaze shifted again, that same involuntary flick toward the window. Toward the barn. Like she was afraid of what she might see. Like she expected something, or someone, to step out of the shadows. A realization settled over me quietly, like dust from the rafters. She wasn't dodging my questions out of stubbornness or old age. She was protecting something. Or someone. And whatever it was. It lived in the quiet spaces she refused to fill. My grandmother pushed her tea away, the cup barely touched. Her hands folded in her lap, small and tired. The room felt too still, too careful, like the house itself was trying not to breathe too loudly. I looked again toward the window. The barn sat in the distance, calm and ordinary in the sunlight. But it didn't feel ordinary anymore. "Grandma," I said softly, "what are you afraid I'll find?" She didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. Instead, Her eyes drifted toward the barn one last time, lingering there just a second too long. A second that told me everything. Whatever was waiting out there. She already knew it wasn't finished with us. The attic air tasted like old summers, warm, still, and a little sweet, the way wood gets when it hasn't been touched in years. I pulled the string for the single bulb, and its light flickered before settling into a weak, yellow glow. Dust drifted through it like falling ash. For a moment, the house felt like it was holding its breath. I hadn't climbed those attic steps since my father died. But that morning, something in me whispered the same thing he used to say when I got scared of the dark corners. Look closer. So I did. The floor creaked under my weight, slow and complaining, as if I was waking it up from a long sleep. Boxes were stacked everywhere, old holiday things, broken lamps, the pink tricycle I rode into a ditch when I was 5. Nothing here had meaning until it suddenly did. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe an old letter. Maybe another carved message. Or maybe just something that told me why my father's name had been cut into fresh wood out there in the barn. The morning light pushed through the small attic window, turning the dust into a soft haze. I could hear the wind outside brushing against the shingles, light and rhythmic, like someone pacing on the roof. I knelt in front of a stack of boxes labeled in my father's handwriting, that slow, steady script he had, the kind that looked like he took his time with each letter. He always did things slowly. Purposefully. I opened the first box. Just yellowed receipts. Old photographs. A map of the county from before the flood changed the roads. Nothing strange. Nothing that explained why someone had carved his name like a warning. Still, I kept digging. Something in my chest told me not to stop. Something in the house did too. It was the smallest box that caught my eye, pushed far into the corner, half buried under a thick sheet of spider webs. A metal lockbox. The kind my father never used unless something mattered. I pulled it toward me, feeling the chill of the metal even in the warm attic air. A thin layer of dust clung to my palms. The lock had been broken. Not recently, but not decades ago either. I opened the lid with a slow breath. Empty. Completely empty. But the absence itself felt loud. Like someone had scooped the heart out of the box and left only the outline behind. I ran my fingers over the bottom. A faint rectangular imprint sat in the center, the exact size of a folder. A folder had been here. 4 years. Long enough for the dust to create a border around it. And then someone took it. My throat tightened. Inside the lid, barely visible in the weak light, were pencil marks, small notes my father wrote to himself. He used to scribble reminders everywhere, on jars, on tool handles, on the back of receipts. But these notes weren't reminders. They were initials. Dates. A half-written sentence. And one word underlined twice. Keep. Whatever he kept, it wasn't here anymore. I sat back on my heels, the lockbox still open in front of me. The attic felt different then, colder, somehow. Like the absence of those papers had pulled something else out of the room with them. Why would anyone come back after all these years just to take something? Something my father guarded so carefully he kept it in a locked metal box nobody ever touched. I thought of the carving in the barn, the fresh wood, the name cut into it like a whisper dragged across time. My father's name. Now an empty box. Now notes I couldn't fully read. My grandmother's trembling hands from earlier. Her eyes drifting toward the barn like a habit she didn't know she had. Everything felt connected, but in a shape I couldn't see yet. A soft thump sounded from somewhere below the attic floorboards. Not loud. Just enough to remind me I wasn't alone in the house. Or maybe I was. Grief can sound like footsteps when a house is too quiet. Still, something in me listened. My father once told me that secrets don't stay buried. They breathe, he'd said. And one day, they always push their way back out. Looking at the empty box, I felt something pushing. Not from the past. From the present. Someone had been here. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. I placed the empty lockbox back where I found it, though my hands shook more than I wanted them to. The light bulb hummed above me, flickering once as if the house was thinking. I stood and walked toward the attic door, but before stepping out, I turned back. The dust had settled where the lockbox had been. But the imprint, that missing folder-shaped shadow, held its place. Something had been taken. Recently. And if someone went through this trouble to hide the fact they took it, then whatever was inside that folder wasn't just important. It was dangerous. I pulled the attic door shut behind me. The house seemed to listen as I whispered, almost to myself. I think someone came back. The morning felt thin, like the light hadn't fully decided to stay. Mist hung low across the yard, soft enough to blur the edges of things, the fence, the gravel path, even the barn that had kept me awake half the night. I stepped outside with a mug I didn't drink from, letting the steam rise between my face and the world. The air smelled like cold soil and something older, something unsettled. That's when I heard my name. Quiet. Almost folded into the wind. Morning, Mr. Lake called, standing at the edge of his porch like he'd been waiting. Mr. Lake wasn't the type to wander over. He was the kind of man who lived like the world might break if he stepped too heavy on it, slow movements, quiet words, soft footfalls. He lifted a hand in a half-wave, his flannel shirt hanging loose on his thin frame. His hair, white and wispy, caught what little sunlight there was. I hadn't seen him this close in years. Not since my father's funeral. He didn't smile, not really. Just looked at me the way old men do when they've learned more from silence than from talking. "You up early?" he said. I nodded. Couldn't sleep. He let the words settle. Didn't push. A crow cawed from somewhere near the fence, breaking the stillness that had grown between us. Mr. Lake shifted his weight and cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, eyes sliding toward the barn. "Everything all right over there?" My grip tightened on the mug. The barn sat still and silent, its windows dark. It didn't look like the place that had felt alive the day before. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, not like he was unsure, but like he didn't want to be the one to say the thing that would change everything. Finally, he looked at me. Directly. "Your lights were on last night." I blinked. For a second, the words didn't make sense. "What lights?" "The barn lights," he said softly. "The overhead ones. Bright as day." My mouth went dry. I didn't turn anything on. He studied me, trying to read the truth off my face. "Figured you hadn't. You've been, well. You've been inside." The wind picked up, tugging at the hem of my shirt. The barn door creaked, not opening, just remembering how. Mr. Lake stepped down from his porch, boots pressing into the wet ground. He walked closer, slow and deliberate, like a man circling a memory. "Saw a fella go in," he said. "Tall. Dark coat. Quiet on his feet." My heart tripped. "What time?" "Just after midnight." The mug warmed my palms, but the rest of me went cold. I pictured the figure he described. A silhouette slipping into the barn. Moving through the dark. Familiar with the space. Did you recognize him? I asked. The world around me softened, like sound itself stepped back. The wind quieted. Even the crow fell silent. Only Mr. Lake's words stayed loud in my mind. A tall man. A dark coat. Moving like someone who'd walked that land for years. I swallowed, but my throat felt made of dust. My father, I started, but the words cracked before they reached the air. Mr. Lake looked at me with something like sympathy, or maybe caution. I know what you're thinking, he said gently. But some memories, they walk even after the people are gone. He wasn't trying to scare me. He believed what he said. That barn's always held stories, he went on. Your father kept to himself, but he wasn't the only one who knew what was in there. My heart kicked at the inside of my chest. What do you mean? He hesitated again. Looked down at his hands, clasped loosely in front of him. There were folks who came and went, he murmured. Late nights. Early mornings. Your father didn't like being watched, so I never asked. A coldness spread through me, not fear, just a quiet understanding that the life I thought my father lived was smaller than the truth. And last night, I said, you think one of them came back? I think someone did, he replied. Someone who knew where to step. Where not to. Someone who wasn't surprised by the dark. The barn stood still, but it wasn't silent anymore. Not to me. It felt like it knew we were talking about it. Mr. Lake turned to go, but stopped halfway. If you're going out there, he said without looking back, don't go alone. He walked away slowly, leaving his words behind like footprints I didn't want to follow. I looked at the barn, its old wooden boards, its shadowed doorway, its windows blank as closed eyes. A tall man. A dark coat. Past midnight. Moving like he belonged. I felt the morning settle around me, cold, expectant, waiting. I set my untouched mug on the porch railing. The steam faded, just like the mist. Someone had been in my barn. Someone who shouldn't have been. Someone who knew my father's steps better than I did. And whoever he was, he wasn't done. The night felt heavier than it should have, pressing down on the fields until even the crickets quieted. I walked toward the barn with only a pocket flashlight, its beam trembling every time my hand did. The door stood there, half open, as though the last person who entered never cared to close it behind them. The cold bit at my cheeks, but the air slipping out of the barn carried a different warmth. A lived-in warmth. I paused at the threshold, listening for anything human, breath, steps, the shift of weight on old boards. But the darkness only breathed back. I stepped inside slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The barn had always been a place that held its silence like a secret, thick, patient, unmoving. But that night, it felt restless. My flashlight skimmed across the old beams, the tools hanging from rusted nails, the hay flattened from years of neglect. Everything familiar, and yet off by a few inches, like someone had walked through my memories and moved them without asking. I reached for an overturned bucket and steadied myself. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots, not in the way old wood does, but in the way wood does after being used recently. The warmth inside felt wrong, too. It wasn't the kind that drifted from sunlight trapped in the walls. It felt like breath. Like presence. I let the light travel slowly, as if rushing might disturb whatever still lingered in the air. A screwdriver lay at the center of the barn floor, not where it used to be on the shelf. Beside it, an empty jar. A cloth folded too neatly to be accidental. I crouched and touched the cloth with my fingertips. It was still soft, not stiff with age. Someone had been here. Recently. Comfortably. The thought scraped something deep inside me, a fear I hadn't named yet, and didn't want to. I moved toward the far wall where my father's name was carved. The wood around it looked the same as before, pale, raw, too new for a man gone 10 years. My flashlight hovered over the grooves. They caught the light sharply, making the letters glow faintly. But something else pulled at my attention. The ground beneath the carving looked disturbed. Like someone had knelt there. Like someone had dug. I stepped closer. My breath echoed too loudly in the small space, betraying the tightness in my chest. Kneeling, I brushed my hand over the dirt. It shifted under my palm, looser than the rest of the packed earth around it. Fresh. I swept more of it aside, pushing small clumps away from the wall. My fingers brushed something hard and cold. A thin metallic edge. Not deep, only buried under a few inches of soil, almost as if someone wanted it to be found. My pulse climbed, quick and sharp. "What were you hiding?" I whispered, though the barn swallowed the sound before my ears caught it. I dug more with shaking hands until a narrow object revealed itself. Metal. Dark with age. Long enough to be deliberate. A box? A tool? A message? The dust clung to my palms as if trying to keep the secret covered. I sat back on my heels. The barn seemed to exhale, the air shifting just enough to make the hanging tools sway. Their soft clinks echoed like a warning. Whatever was buried here, someone wanted me to find it. But maybe not yet. I reached forward again, sliding my fingers around the metallic object's edge. It resisted at first, like it had grown roots into the soil. When it finally loosened, a small cloud of dust rose up around my hands. It was a thin metal case. The kind my father once used for storing important things, things he didn't want anyone else touching. The latch was rusted shut. My father never rusted anything shut. He cleaned his tools religiously. He kept everything oiled, orderly. Someone else must have handled this. And recently. I held the case in my lap, feeling its weight. Not heavy, but meaningful. Like a closed mouth holding back a story. As I traced its edge, a faint tremor passed through the barn. Maybe wind. Maybe the old beams settling. But it felt like something shifting inside the walls themselves, like a memory waking up. A sudden cold draft brushed my neck, raising every hair. I turned sharply, lifting the flashlight. The barn stood empty. No footsteps. No breath. No shadow that didn't belong to me. Still, the warmth from earlier had vanished. The air felt colder than outside now, as though the presence that warmed it had slipped out moments before. I looked down at the metal case, its surface smeared with dirt from my hands. My heart beat once, hard. Someone buried it shallow. Someone wanted me to find it easily. Someone trusted I would come back here. But who? And why leave it beneath my father's name? I stood slowly, the case held against my chest like something fragile. The flashlight flickered, just once, enough to make the shadows dance. Enough to make me hold my breath. The barn door creaked behind me, nudged by the wind. But for a moment, I could have sworn it was pushed. I didn't open the case. Not yet. The weight of it felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. As I stepped outside, the night wrapped itself around me, colder than before. The barn loomed behind me, quiet, watching. I looked down at the metal case, streaked with dust and fingerprints that weren't all mine. Whatever waited inside. It was something my father meant to leave behind. And something someone else had come back for. The barn was darker than I remembered. Not night dark. Just the kind that sinks into the corners first, like it knows where to settle. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I should have, letting my eyes adjust, letting the quiet tell its story. The air felt warmer inside than outside. A strange, lived-in warmth, soft, almost human. As if someone had slipped out through the back door just before I arrived. I didn't call out. Some places don't like loud voices. This one hasn't, not since my father left it behind. I stepped in slowly, brushing my hand along the wooden post that always creaked under pressure. It creaked now too, like it remembered me. Things had moved again. The screwdriver, pushed a little too neatly to the edge of the work table. The empty jar, its lid missing. A folded cloth, shaped like someone took their time setting it down. Not messy. Not careless. Just touched. I felt my throat tighten, but not from fear. From familiarity. My father never put anything down without purpose. Neither did the person who had been here. I walked toward the far wall, the one with his name carved into the wood, crooked, stubborn letters done with a blunt knife and too much pride. The dirt below it looked uneven. Fresh. Soft where it should have been settled hard by years. I knelt, my knees pressing into the cold ground. The smell rose first, earthy, raw, like something had been disturbed only moments before. I brushed away the top layer with my fingers, slow enough to listen for anything that might move beneath. And then I felt it. Metal. Thin. Cool. Waiting. When I lifted it out, the dust clung to it like it didn't want to let go. A small rusted key wrapped in an oil-stained cloth. My breath stumbled in my chest. Because I knew that cloth. And I knew that key. My father used it for only one thing. The drawer in his old workshop, the drawer nobody opened after the funeral. Not me. Not my mother. Not the men who came to take his tools. Just him. Always him. I held the key so tight the rust pressed little marks into my palm. I wasn't planning to go anywhere that night. But the next thing I remember, I was outside. Then in the car. Then already on the road, the barn behind me shrinking into a dark, watching shape. I didn't give myself time to think. If I had, I might have turned back. The envelope rested in my hands like it had weight beyond paper. My fingers brushed the edges, feeling the faint warmth that shouldn't have been there. The porch light flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the car hood, across my own face, across the envelope that carried a name I hadn't touched in years. I almost didn't open it. Almost. Because I already knew what was inside. And because some truths, once held, can't be put back in the dark. I slid the flap open, and the world seemed to exhale. The paper inside was crisp, impossibly so. My father's handwriting sprawled across the page, the loops of his letters, the firm dips of his signature, the way he pressed harder in some words than others. But the date caught me first. 2 months ago. 2 months after his funeral. 2 months after I'd buried him. I set the envelope on my lap, careful not to spill the words that waited inside. The night pressed close. My car engine hummed faintly, idling, but I didn't want to move. Didn't want to be anywhere but here, with this impossible truth resting on my knees. I traced a finger along the first line. I am being watched. There are things left unfinished that could hurt the family. The words weren't just words. They were a pulse. A warning. Something meant to reach me, even if I didn't understand it yet. I swallowed. My throat felt too tight for breath. I wanted to believe it was a forgery. A trick. My mind tried to rationalize it, someone playing with grief, someone clever enough to copy his handwriting. But the ink smudged under my fingertip. Softly. Wetly. As if he had just set it down. And then, like a thread pulled through time, I remembered every note he ever left for me, hidden under tools, inside drawers, tucked into corners of the barn. Look closer, he'd always said. I looked closer. The letter unfolded in my lap. Each line carried the voice I thought I'd lost. I don't know who I can trust anymore. Someone knows the barn, knows the house, knows my steps. I have left keys and clues for you, in case something happens. You must find them before it's too late. My fingers shook. I held the paper, as if letting go would erase it. The sentences twisted tighter around my chest. Danger. Surveillance. Unfinished truths. Words I couldn't unhear. And then the penmanship shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. The letters that ended each sentence seemed sharper. Harder. Like urgency bleeding through calm. I read the next part slowly, mouth dry. I tried to leave quietly, to protect you. But some things don't end when they should. You have to be careful. Follow the signs I left. Trust your instincts. I leaned back in the driver's seat, staring out at the empty road. The streetlight flickered, throwing moving shadows across the dashboard. The line that followed made my stomach twist. If you're reading this, I didn't stay gone. The words hung in the air. I blinked hard. My father. Alive? Or someone using his voice? My mind refused to answer. My chest refused to settle. I touched the paper again. Warm. Real. Certain. The ink had dried enough to not smear further, but the warmth under my fingers suggested minutes, not months. I pressed the envelope against my chest and closed my eyes. Tried to let it sink in. Tried to breathe through it. Every note he'd left me as a child echoed in the silence of the car. The messages hidden in the barn, the careful placement of keys, the whispered instructions, all leading to this impossible moment. I didn't stay gone. The phrase repeated in my head like a chant. My father had died, or so I thought. But now, what if he hadn't? The letter described people watching, danger lurking in familiar places. My pulse hitched at the thought of those shadows moving silently, unseen, knowing every step I took. I gripped the envelope tighter. Could he have really escaped? Planned all of this from somewhere unknown? Or was this a warning from someone else entirely, using his hand, his words, his identity to manipulate me? The night outside my car window pressed in. The trees swayed in the wind, casting branches that looked like fingers across the road. The silence of the empty street felt layered with presence. Watching. Waiting. I swallowed hard. The warmth of the paper radiated against my palm. The message wasn't just written for me, it was alive. And somewhere, beyond the reach of this car, beyond the edge of the porch light, my father, or someone speaking for him, was still in motion. Still leaving signs. Still leaving breadcrumbs. And I had to follow them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope, tucking it against my chest. The warmth stayed. Persistent. Certain. I looked out at the empty road stretching before me. Mist curled along the pavement, blurring the edges of the world I thought I knew. Could my father really still be alive? Or was this a trap, a message from someone who knew too much? I didn't know. All I knew was the pull. The call. The unfinished story waiting for me to pick up where he left off. The envelope's heat reminded me that this wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a presence. And if he, or whoever wrote it, was still out there, I would find the truth. Because some messages don't wait. And some fathers never stay gone. The house smelled faintly of tea and old wood. I sat across from my grandmother at the kitchen table, the dim evening light sliding across her face, highlighting the creases that held a lifetime of secrets. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, the china clinking softly against the saucer. I didn't ask how she was. I didn't need to. I only needed answers. And that night, I refused to leave without them. The clock ticked too loud in the quiet kitchen. Every second stretched longer than it should have, every silence heavier. I leaned forward and waited for her to speak. She didn't look at me at first. Her gaze wandered to the window, where the last traces of sunset faded into grey. The shadows of the trees outside danced along the walls, as if they were eavesdropping on our conversation before it began. "Grandma," I said softly, almost pleading. Her hands paused mid-sip. I could feel the weight of the years between us in that silence, the secrets she had carried, the truths she had buried. I had grown up believing my father was a simple, honest man. A man who loved his family. A man gone too soon. But the key, the letter, the envelope, they had shattered that belief, leaving only questions that demanded answers. Her lips parted slightly, then closed. Her hands gripped the cup harder, knuckles whitening. Finally, a whisper. "I wanted to protect you," she said. Her voice trembled, barely audible over the tick of the clock. I leaned closer. "You've been hiding something." The words were gentle, but I meant them like a hammer. Her eyes flicked to mine, a storm behind them, a storm I hadn't seen before. And then the dam began to crack. She inhaled sharply, as if she were summoning courage from somewhere deep inside. "Your father, he wasn't the man you think he was," she said, each word measured, trembling. I felt my stomach tighten. My knees pressed into the chair, almost buckling. I can't tell you everything," she whispered, "but he was involved in dangerous things. Things that forced him to disappear." I blinked, trying to make sense of her words. "Disappear? What do you mean?" Her eyes darted to the window again, to the barn maybe, to someplace beyond my vision. "The funeral, it wasn't real," she said. I froze. The plate in front of me felt heavier than it had any right to. "They buried an empty casket," she breathed. "Your father, he stayed hidden for your safety. For yours alone." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, echoing against the walls of the small kitchen. The weight of it pressed on me, threatening to topple everything I believed. I swallowed hard. Then, the letter. The barn. The key. Why now? Her hands shook as they fell to the table, fingers curling around each other. "I don't know," she whispered. Something brought him back. I only know he's careful. He always was." The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was charged, alive with questions that had no answers yet. I leaned closer, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and determination. "You mean, he faked his death?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her lips trembled. "Yes," she said. "Not for himself. For you. For your safety. He couldn't leave the family unprotected. Not then. Not ever. I felt my knees weaken. My fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard I thought they might break. If he had been alive all this time, if he had watched from the shadows, hidden in plain sight, then every memory I had of loss was built on a lie. And the barn, I whispered. The carving, the dirt, the key, the letter. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. Clues. Signs. Breadcrumbs, she said. He wanted you to find them, when the time was right. But I never thought it would be so soon. I never thought you'd see the letter before he could explain himself. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I could almost feel him standing somewhere just out of reach, watching. The warmth of the envelope, the shadows of the barn, the trembling of her hands, they all pointed to the same impossible truth. He's alive, I whispered. Yes, she said. And he always planned to come back. But now I fear it's not entirely his choice. The kitchen felt suffocating. And yet, strangely, familiar. Like a place where truth and memory collided. I sank back in my chair, the weight of her confession pressing into my chest. The sound of her shallow breathing filled the silence. Everything I thought I knew had shifted. The man I had mourned, the father I had idolized, the letters I had followed, they all had a new meaning now. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, exhausted. I wanted to protect you from the danger he carried, from the truth buried with him. I touched the envelope in my coat pocket. Warm. Certain. Alive. The barn. The key. The letter. Each sign pointing to him. And somewhere, beyond my reach, my father waited. I didn't know if he was safe, or if he was in danger. But I knew one thing, the story wasn't over. And the buried voices, they were only beginning to speak. The barn was quieter than it had any right to be. No wind pressing against the boards. No birds skimming across the tin roof. Just that thin, trembling kind of silence that makes you wonder if the world is holding its breath with you. I stood at the doorway, fingers resting on the frame, feeling the grain of the old wood under my thumb. It was warm, like someone had just been there. And for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, the carved name I found earlier wasn't a memory at all, but a message. A message he left for me. The sun was dipping low, turning the dust in the air to gold. Every step I took sent up little clouds that shimmered and broke apart. I remembered this place differently, louder, full of life, full of his voice calling out to me like the world itself had room for us both. But now, it felt like walking into a story someone else had already finished writing. The boards creaked under my boots, softer than I expected, almost cautious. My heart was doing the same, beating not out of fear, but out of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And dread. Twisted so tightly together I couldn't tell one from the other. The carved name was still on the wall where I'd left it. My fingers traced it again, slowly, as if touching it too quickly might erase it. He carved it deep, deeper than anyone would for something they wanted to forget. The smell of fresh cut wood lingered, too sharp for a building this old. I breathed it in, steadying myself. Someone had been here. Recently. The barn, it wasn't just holding memories tonight. It was holding secrets. And I could feel them leaning toward me, waiting to be heard. I stepped farther inside, letting the dim light stretch across the dirt floor. Shadows clung to the corners like they were trying to stay hidden. Or maybe, trying to hide something from me. My eyes drifted to the workbench, tools laid out neat, cleaner than I remembered. A small shaving of wood curled on the floor beneath it, pale and fresh. Someone had been carving. Someone had been close. My breath caught. For a second, I imagined him standing there, one hand braced on the bench, his shoulders bent the way they did when he was thinking too hard. I could almost hear the soft scrape of his knife against the wood. Almost hear him humming under his breath like he used to. I turned toward the center of the barn, trying to picture his footsteps in the dust, but the floor told me nothing. Whoever it was had moved with purpose. Care. Like they didn't want to leave a trace. My fingers twitched at my sides. Something wasn't fitting right, the quiet, the wood, the way the air felt too warm in a place that never held heat. Then it happened. The floorboard behind me shifted, just enough to break the silence. Not loud. Not frantic. Just certain. A single footstep. And everything inside me went still. I didn't turn right away. Sometimes fear makes your body slow, like it wants to hear the danger before it sees it. The smell of the wood grew sharper, pushing against my breath. The air changed, heavier, as if someone else was breathing it too. When I finally turned, it was slow. Deliberate. Like the moment itself wanted to give me time to prepare. Between the slanted beams, in the far corner, where the light couldn't quite reach, a shadow stood taller than the tools hanging on the wall. Unmoving. Watching. My throat tightened, but no sound came out. The figure didn't step forward, or back. Just stayed there, like it had been waiting long before I arrived. 1,000 thoughts hit me at once. His height. His posture. The way he sometimes stood with his hands tucked into his pockets, head tilted just slightly. Could it be him? Here, after all this time? After all the dead ends and whispered warnings? But the barn felt wrong. The silence felt wrong. And the shadow, it didn't have the softness he carried, the quiet warmth that followed him even on his worst days. This one felt rigid. Guarded. Almost protective, but not of me. When it finally shifted, the movement was slow, purposeful, like it was blocking something behind it. Or hiding the truth from me. The carved name on the wall suddenly felt less like a message, and more like a warning I had walked straight into. I stepped back without meaning to, the dirt soft beneath my heel. The shadow didn't move. Just watched, breathing the same heavy air I was. Outside, the last of the sunlight slipped behind the tree line, and the barn fell into a deeper kind of darkness, the kind that pulls the truth closer. I thought I came here to find him. To finally piece together what he left behind. But standing there, with that silent figure waiting in the dark, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit. Someone else had been searching too. And they had found this place before I did. The floor creaked again, one quiet step forward. I didn't run. But my heart did. The barn smelled of sawdust and old wood, the kind that holds a lifetime of echoes. Dust motes drifted in the last slant of sunlight, catching on the edges of tools, the beams, the floorboards. I froze at the center, my boots barely making a sound on the worn wood. The shadow I had seen earlier shifted. And then stepped fully into the light. Time slowed. The face that emerged was both foreign and achingly familiar. Older. Thinner. Lines around the eyes deepened, hair streaked with grey. But the gaze was the same quiet intensity one had memorized as a child. It was him. Or at least, it looked like him. I couldn't speak at first. My chest felt too tight, my hands too heavy. Every story I had told myself about the past, every memory I had clung to, seemed to tremble under the weight of this moment. He didn't move too quickly. There was caution in every gesture, as though even standing in the open made him vulnerable. I carved it for you, he said softly, voice roughened by years of absence. My father who had disappeared, who I had mourned, who I had imagined in hundreds of impossible ways. I wanted you to know I was alive, he continued, but also, to warn you. You were in danger. The words hung between us, heavier than the dust drifting in the air. I remembered the envelope, the letter, the key, everything pointing to him. And now he was here, in the same space where I had trembled with questions just minutes ago. His eyes scanned mine slowly, searching, weighing. I realized then that he had carried secrets not to deceive, but to protect. But years of silence had made them almost unbearable. And still, the intensity in his gaze made it clear, he had never stopped watching, never stopped thinking of me. I took a step closer, boots creaking on the boards. The sunlight was fading, leaving only streaks of gold and shadow to define the shapes of the barn. I noticed the slight stoop of his shoulders, the thinness of his arms, the lines that time had etched onto his face. You carved your name? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. Yes. I wanted you to find it before anything, before anyone, could hurt you. He glanced at the wall, then back at me. I had to make sure you understood, even if you didn't see me yet. I swallowed hard. Why now? I asked, the words trembling. After all these years. He stepped forward slowly. Closer, but not too close. The danger isn't over, he said, eyes flicking to the shadows around the barn. Someone has been watching. Someone who knew more than I realized. You had to be ready. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Everything, the key, the envelope, the footprints in the dirt, suddenly made sense. Each clue, each hidden message, each whisper of the past had been his way of keeping me safe while he prepared for this reunion. But now, standing here, facing him, I understood that safety came with a price. The years we had lost, the things we couldn't undo. He reached out slowly, hand trembling slightly. I hesitated, my own hand frozen in midair. Every instinct screamed caution. Every memory of love and fear collided at once. I missed you, he said quietly. I thought I was keeping you safe, but I was only keeping the truth buried. The dust swirled around our feet, as I finally let my fingers brush his. The weight of the years pressed between us. I felt the unsaid apologies, the hidden dangers, the moments he had missed, everything he had carried alone. I didn't stay gone, he continued. And I never stopped thinking about how to protect you. But, some things can't be controlled. His eyes glistened in the dim light, full of a lifetime I hadn't lived with him. All at once, the barn felt smaller and larger, crammed with history yet empty of the warmth I had imagined. You have to trust me, he whispered. But understand, nothing is simple. Not danger. Not family. Not the choices we make to survive. I nodded, barely breathing. The past, tangled and painful, stretched before us like the shadows across the floor. And yet, in his presence, I felt the possibility of something fragile, a beginning, despite everything. We stood there, hands brushing, the dust drifting around us like forgotten memories. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of his absence and the presence of his return at once. Why now? I asked softly. Because it was time, he said. And because you needed to know the truth before it was too late. I looked at him, at the carved name, at the barn that had held decades of secrets. Everything pointed to him, to us, to the choices that had kept us apart. The sunlight faded completely, leaving only the warm glow of a single beam that lit his face. I realized then that a reunion wasn't just a moment of joy. It was a reckoning. And the past we thought was dead was waiting for us to face it, together. The barn creaked around us, dust settling like whispered voices. I held his hand tighter, unsure of the future, but certain of one truth. He was here. And nothing would ever be the same.